Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. The UN Peacekeeping Mission in Cyprus was first established in 1964 to prevent communal violence between the Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot communities. 10 years later, in 1974, the mission expanded further to its current form. At the time, the Turkish military had invaded Cyprus in response to a coup on the island. Peacekeepers deployed to maintain a fragile ceasefire, and to this day there are still over 1,200 personnel deployed to the UN peacekeeping force in Cyprus. On the line to explain why this peacekeeping mission is still needed after all these years is Peter Yeo. He is president of the Better World Campaign and senior vice president of the United Nations Foundation. Peter Yeo is a veteran observer of UN peacekeeping who recently visited the mission in Cyprus. We kick off discussing the history of the mission before having a broader conversation about its still relevant work after all these years. As I mentioned in this conversation, the UN peacekeeping mission in Cyprus is not something I've covered extensively over my many years covering the UN, and I think reflecting now, that's largely due to the fact that the peacekeeping mission does a very decent job of preventing disputes from turning into the kind of conflict that would demand international media coverage. Anyway, I learned a lot from this conversation. I suspect you will too. And now here is Peter Yeo, president of the Better World Campaign and senior vice president at the United Nations Foundation.
Conflict in Cyprus is really derivative of the differences between the Greek Cypriot and the Turkish Cypriot communities. These differences are not new. They frankly have been going on for centuries. But they really came to head in 1974 when there was a coup in Cyprus that was followed very shortly thereafter by a Turkish government invasion of the northern part of Cyprus, which is sort of the more Turkish Cypriot part of the island. And so ever since 1974, we have experienced a divided island between the Turkish Cypriot and the Greek Cypriot communities. It's frustrating because most Turkish Cypriots and most Greek Cypriots view themselves first and foremost as Cypriots. They were born in Cyprus, they were raised in Cyprus, and there's a lot that brings them together. But these differences that exist between the Greek and Turkish communities are not new and really have been driving the conflict there for quite a long time. And in fact, I think are getting worse, not better.
Oh, we'll get into that in a minute. So when did peacekeepers deploy and what were they intended to do?
You know, the peacekeepers deployed in and around the invasion, and the goal was to separate the Turkish Cypriot and Greek Cypriot communities and to patrol the demilitarized zone that separates the northern part of Cyprus and the southern part of Cyprus. And in some places, it's meters wide, this demilitarized zone in Nicosia, the capital, or the traditional capital. The differences, it's just meters wide, but in other parts of the demilitarized zones, it's several kilometers wide. So they were deployed to not only prevent the two communities from fighting and resuming fighting, but also to engage in these sort of trust-building exercises designed to keep lanes of communication and dialogue open between the Greek and Turkish Cypriot communities. If there's ever going to be a solution to this crisis, you have to have a generation of Cypriots that actually know somebody on the other side and are used to dealing with somebody on the other side. And the UN has a lot of activities designed to deal with that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems it was deployed in almost like the most classical kind of peacekeeping mission you could imagine, just sort of to provide a buffer between two fighting parties to give them, breathing space to let peace or at least a non-aggression take hold. What does the mission look like today? How many peacekeepers are we talking about, and what is their day-to-day work, today in 2021?
Well, let me first pick up in your first point, which is that I do think that when people think about peacekeeping, they actually think about the type of peacekeeping mission that occurs in Cyprus, as
Old
well
school
as,
peacekeeping.
yeah, that's classical peacekeeping. I mean, and there's a similar mission in Kashmir that is classical peacekeeping, which is basically there is a peace. It may be a tenuous peace, but there is a peace to keep. And the goal is to keep conflicting parties away from each other and from allowing misunderstandings to escalate and tensions to escalate so that there is a resumption of conflict. That's classical peacekeeping. That's not where most peacekeeping is today. It's much more kinetic and focused on civilian protection. But I think when you look at Cyprus, it's a classic peacekeeping mission. And when you look at what the 1,000+ peacekeepers in Cyprus do today, they are patrolling the border, the demilitarized zone, the buffer zone, on foot, in trucks, in the air. Their goal is there's a lot of farmers living in the buffer zone, and they're trying to avoid any changes to the status quo so that more land is not taken than prior. Or in Nicosia, which is very narrow, they're trying to avoid a situation where conflicts and disagreements in Nicosia spill over and lead to a much broader conflict. Frankly, we can't risk a conflict since both Greece and Turkey are NATO members. So, it's sort of a lot of patrolling and then a lot of confidence building measures that is done by the political staff, everything from returning the remains of Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots that were killed during the 1974 conflict, returning them to their families, which is important to bring some closure. They also work on these technical committees that, for instance, work on policing to ensure that criminals can't commit a crime in a northern part of Cyprus and flee to the southern part of Cyprus and avoid any prosecution and arrest. So these technical committees really do an important job in terms of building confidence and trust over time.
I mean, it sounds, based on what you're describing, that a lot of this work revolves around managing what are very local and low level disputes, say over a farmer's land, capturing a criminal that's fled from one side or to another, as a way to prevent these kind of very local disputes from turning into broader conflict.
Oh, it's completely true. I mean, it's not particularly sexy. There's no guns, there's no fighting. It's just plain old fashioned peacemaking, and trying to make sure that, if somebody's building a new shed to store the soccer equipment at, a particular school that's right on the buffer zone, that they don't expand the size of the shed, but yet that's important. That's necessary in order to, avoid a situation where either side feels that the other side is encroaching upon them, is taking advantage of them, all of which could lead to significant increases in tension and the potential resumption of conflict.
And you think, after having visited there, that peacekeepers are necessary for that, to play that role still so many decades later?
Oh, absolutely. We talked to the people in the diplomatic community. We talked to both, Greek and Turkish Cypriots, and it is quite clear that they want the peacekeepers to remain, and that, as one unnamed diplomat said to us, there would be war within a week if the UN peacekeepers were not there. And so, yes, I absolutely believe that it's valuable and important that the peacekeepers remain, even though it's just 1,000 of them, even though they're not in terribly high profile. Their work is important, and frankly, it's a bargain given what we pay for the peacekeeping mission in Cyprus. It's a bargain to ensure continued peace between not only the Greek and Turkish Cypriot communities, but between Greece and Turkey.
It's interesting. I've covered the UN since 2005, and I will admit I have not given a lot of thought to peacekeeping in Cyprus. Probably, because the reasons you described. There's no conflict there. There hasn't been a hot conflict there, and it really doesn't make headlines because it seems that the peacekeepers are doing their jobs and managing those low-level disputes before they turn into broader conflict.
Well, I've been working on UN peacekeeping issues for a couple decades now. And the number of times people have said to me, let's just get rid of these longstanding peacekeeping missions. Surely we can do that, right? And yet when you peel the onion and understand why the peacekeepers are still in Cyprus, it's far more complicated than you think. And, you're definitely left with the impression that there's a continued role for UN peacekeepers in Cyprus, and particularly since I think the tensions are going to get worse, not better, in the foreseeable future.
I want to get back to that question you just raised, that issue just raised about tensions being worse but not better. But I want to pick up on your spot about these kind of other, decades on missions. I'm thinking, as you said, Jammu Kashmir or Sinai or Golan and Cyprus. I mean, you compare that to other peacekeeping missions that have ended, sometimes successfully ended, like Liberia or Sierra Leone or like El Salvador. Sometimes they're kind of forced to close for political reasons. But then you have these kind of, forever missions that you just described that do seem, as you said, to be playing like an important role in maintaining international peace and security, even though we don't think about them very much.
Well, and I've been to the mission in Golan, and I've, on the Golan Heights, and it's yet another example of people say, well, certainly we can get rid of the mission in Golan. And yet, when you talk to government of Israel officials and you talk to people that are living on the Golan, they see the role of peacekeepers as pretty important in terms of being that neutral party that is actually controlling whether people cross or don't cross into the Golan. So much maligned and yet much important and very important at the same time.
So why do you think that the situation on the ground in Cyprus is poised to get worse?
I think the challenge is that the political situation in Turkey is constantly changing. I think that Erdogan, loves to appeal to nationalist instincts within his own country. And Cyprus, and the Turkish part of Cyprus, is part of that appeal to nationalism. And I think that the potential flashpoint is around, a part of Famagusta, the city of Famagusta, called Varosha. And just to back up for a second, Varosha was a largely Greek-owned tourist resort back in the day.
Yeah, like the stars would go there, right?
The stars, the stars
would Newman and all that, yeah.
Yeah, and for the past, since 1974, it's been frozen in time, largely, with the hotels empty and frozen, and the lobbies empty, and the car dealerships with cars in the lobby from the 1974. That's Varosha. But the Turkish Cypriots, together with the Turkish government, have taken steps to remove control of Varosha from the military to civilians, and then are talking about, over time, promoting civilian resettlement into Varosha. They're already allowing more, basically, tourists to go into Varosha to check things out. And that is causing a lot of anger and angst. in the southern part of in the Republic of Cyprus, among the Greek Cypriot communities who feel that the Turks are trying to create new facts on the ground and to basically make sure that Varosha now and forever will be part of Turkey and the northern part of Cyprus. So this is going to get worse before it gets better. And so I know that the UN peacekeeping operation in Cyprus is very focused on this. And I think ultimately what's going to solve the situation in Varosha is, broader peace discussions and negotiations that are, again, sponsored by the United Nations between the Greek and Turkish Cypriot communities. But frankly, those are going nowhere fast. I think the other thing go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say the only other thing that's changed, that's made it more challenging from a peacekeeping point of view, is that there were elections in the northern part of Cyprus a couple of years ago, and the president, the so-called president of the northern Cyprus, very much believes that there should be a separate country, and he only will engage in negotiations if the rest of the world recognizes that the northern part of Cyprus is a sovereign nation, which the rest of the world is not going to do at this point in time. So that really does create problems in terms of a long-term peace to the island.
Well, that kind of leads me to this idea that, maybe in a way, the success of the peacekeeping mission in terms of keeping a lid on conflict and preventing it from spiraling out of the control is actually a hindrance to broader political agreement. Like the status quo is like, okay, people aren't getting killed. It seems that this creates almost like a perverse incentive in terms of there being any urgency around a broader peace negotiation or peace deal.
Well, it is true that the fact that the peacekeepers are there, keeping, frankly, a lid on the situation, definitely reduces the urgency of discussions. That said, the issues that are holding up a broader settlement between the Turkish and Greek Cypriot communities are so broad and built in. And the geopolitical situation related to the conflict is so complex that I don't believe that the continued existence of the peacekeeping force is a hindrance to a resumption of meaningful peace discussions. To do that, you're going to really have to work in Greece and Turkey and, frankly, in the UN Security Council members who are very supportive of the Greek Cypriot community to find a way forward in terms of peace discussions. The Secretary General has invested, his personal time on this. He recently met with the heads of the Greek and Turkish Cypriot communities in New York on the margins of Unga. So it's not for lack of trying, but I think that we can't fix the challenge, which is that the major international players, members of the Security Council, do not view Cyprus as a top 10 foreign policy and national security priority. And as long as that remains the case, then we're going to continue to see a lack of real meaningful progress in terms of resolving the Cyprus conflict.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for your time. This was very helpful.
My pleasure.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Peter Yeo. And if you are a regular listener to the podcast, I do request that you leave a review of the show, particularly if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts. It's a helpful way of letting other people discover the show. All right, we'll see you next time. Bye.